talking about the EU referendum and about migration.
An honest debate about who are the people that are coming. You know, when I sat in that meeting yesterday with President Schulz of the European Parliament, he kept using the word refugee. And indeed, in many of the news reports in Britain, I keep hearing the word refugee, albeit interspersed with the word migrant. I think at times we're not quite sure what we're actually talking about. A refugee is, by definition, from the United Nations, an individual with a well-founded fear of persecution, usually for reasons of race, class, religion, or sexual orientation. And I have to say that whilst we focus today on the Syrian problem, actually, most of the people that have come over the course of the last year across the Mediterranean have come from countries like Somalia, Mali, Nigeria, Mauritania, and the vast majority of those that have come have been, and this is unavoidable, have been young males. And whilst conditions in some of those countries may not be very nice, it is incredibly difficult to see how more than a few of those people would qualify as genuine refugees. Indeed, the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico, said this week, EU leaders are not telling the truth about the backgrounds of the majority of people. 95% are economic migrants. And I noticed yesterday the Hungarian MEP and Monet professor and great proponent of all things EU, Chopin, and very moderate conservative, said that he'd noticed that the migrants that were travelling through Hungary were in many cases wealthier than the people that actually lived in rural Hungary. So the EU, seems to me, has got this wrong. Anybody that comes from whatever background and virtually for whatever reason can claim to be a refugee. And I would have thought that if the European Union wants to help genuine refugees, they need to establish offshore centres and process people correctly rather than inviting what has now turned into a headlong rush. And there is a further element to this that I think is even more sinister and even more dangerous. When ISIS say they will use the migrant tide to flood Europe with 500,000 of their own jihadists, I think we'd better listen. 500,000 may not be realistic, but what if it's 5,000? What if it's 500? And already one of the ISIS terrorist suspects who committed the first atrocity against holidaymakers in Tunisia has been seen getting off a boat onto Italian soil. At the moment, the European Union's common asylum policy has absolutely no means whatsoever of checking anybody's background. And I would say that we must not allow our compassion to imperil our safety. Now, I do believe myself this EU crisis was very easy to predict, and I think the continual policy failures mean the situation is likely, I'm afraid, to get worse and not better. But what about the United Kingdom? Well, I'm very pleased to say that we didn't just opt out of the euro, we opted out of Schengen. Thank goodness we did. And I'm also pleased to say that we opted out of the European Union's common asylum policy. But that, of course, does not make us immune from the failure of EU policy. And you only have to look, of course, at Calais and the summer of total disruption in Kent to understand the problem. We also, of course, face the risk that at some point, whether it's in Italy or a Greece or a Hungary, but at some point, somebody gets so tired of what is going on and realises that the burden-sharing plan within the common asylum policy isn't working, that, of course, all they have to do is to issue people with EU passports, and then, of course, they would be free to travel to the United Kingdom. So we're not immune from it in any way, we're not isolated from it in any way. And the cries today, of course, over the last 48 hours, since that horrible, depressing, saddening picture, have been, well, how many do you think Britain should take? Well, of course, the answer is, ladies and gentlemen, that last year we took 640,000 people. 640,000 people came here through borderless Britain chiefly as a result of our EU membership. And a huge number of those who came last year were, by definition, relatively poor people who were economic migrants. And we do take refugees. There's a sort of myth that Britain doesn't take refugees. We do take refugees. We take refugees every year. About 4% of last year's total were refugees. As an average over the last few years, around about 25,000 to 30,000 people come to Britain as refugees every single year. And let me be clear, there have been a lot of things that have been said over the course of the last couple of years about UKIP and what it stands for. A lot of attempts to demonise UKIP in the eyes of the public. But ever since the inception of this party, UKIP has always believed that the United Kingdom is a country with a fine record of helping people and helping genuine refugees. And we've always stood by that. And I was, if you remember, in 2013, the first party leader in Britain to suggest that we should offer some refugee places to a few thousand people from Syria. I was the first person to even begin talking about that. Perhaps that's no surprise. After all, my predecessors were French Protestants who came to Britain in the 18th century.
Nigel Farage, they're launching UKIP's Out campaign, urging people to vote to leave the EU when the